Good evening. The liquidity crisis in the power sector of several states in India has been a cause for concern for central government and the state governments alike. With accumulated losses close to rupees 1 trillion and outstanding liabilities in excess of rupees 3 trillion to Indian financial institutions, the current crisis, experts say, is of a far bigger magnitude than the one the country experienced in 2002-2003. Back then, a committee under Montek Singh Ahluwalia had recommended and implemented a one-time settlement scheme with central power sector undertakings. Analysts have opined that a current crisis is more alarming because the worst affected parties this time around are Indian financial institutions, namely public sector banks and non-banking financial institutions or NBFCs. And how's the government handling this situation now? For starters, the Cabinet Committee on Economic Affairs on Monday approved restructuring of rupees 1.9 lakh crore debt of state electricity boards. The move is aimed at benefiting the lenders and power companies in the long term. Under this scheme, the most recent bailout of the power sector, 50% of the short-term outstanding liabilities would be taken over by state governments and the balance 50% loans would be restructured by providing moratorium on principal and best possible terms for repayments. Some analysts have said that the SEB bailout package would be a longer-term positive for the power sector if the discipline of the tariff revisions is maintained. Others are not that impressed and have said that this falls short of expectations and instead of representing a tangible measure of reforms and will only serve as yet another bailout. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight on The Big Picture, we discuss the CCEA's decision and debate whether the latest scheme amounts to power sector reforms or just another stopgap, short-term attempt to keep the sector from bleeding further. We'll also ask our panel of experts to help us with a prescription for the future so that perhaps 10 years or 15 years down the line, a bailout every other year might not be necessary. And with me in the studio is Soma Banerjee, National Policy Editor at the Economic Times. Joining her on the panel will be Mr. I.A. Khan, Advisor, Energy in the Planning Commission. And completing the panel will be Anil Razdan, former Secretary in the Ministry of Power. I welcome you all to the show. I'd like to start with Soma, if I could. First things first, Soma, is this a step towards tangible reforms, or as some have called it, yet another short-term myopic bailout? Your opening remarks on the CCEA decision yesterday.
Well, I would go with the myopic viewpoint simply because I think the conditions that are being imposed to see that state electricity boards really reform are not enough. We've seen how regulators, despite being there, have done very little as far as tariff revisions are concerned, and until and unless that is made particularly independent and forceful, we will not see tariff revisions happening, and this will be a case yet again in another 10 years. So as far as SEBs are concerned and a bailout is concerned, I guess there was no other option left for the government, but I think there needed to be more riders or conditions fulfilled before this is done. At least saying that no minimum cost of power is covered in tariffs, which was the prescription by the Electricity Act. Right.
Mr. Razdan, if I could come to you for a second and ask you that there is a popular view among experts, and Soma will bear me out on this again, that this latest scheme approved by the CCEA underlines yet again the sheer bankruptcy of the politics of free power, repressed tariffs and patronage of power theft. Populism takes its toll and it erodes the power sector and the state's ability to invest further in other sectors like the social sector. Would you agree with that analysis?
I wouldn't agree with that analysis because you see, you must respect that the Act has created an institution of regulators which is supposed to be independent. So what other independence are we looking for? Well, that's another question, that the regulators have not done their job. But you cannot tinker with the powers given to them without interfering with the Act now or amending the Act, which was done after a lot of deliberation and consultation. So I think what it requires is a very strong media and public attention on what the regulators are doing and their accountability. It is absolutely a measure of policy whether you want to charge a full tariff or cost tariff to a certain section of the population or you want to subsidize others. There is a certain procedure given on the extent of subsidy that you ought to be charging in the various policy documents that have come down. But I think the sickness has come essentially on account of, I think, poor regulation. And that has been the state regulatory bodies. Some of them have performed well. It's not that the Act itself is defective. you've seen that some states are doing well, the others are not. Though the large majority of them are not doing well, I concede. The basic thing is that the AT&C losses have not come down in the proportion in which they ought to have come down. I think we've not improved the distribution system. There has not been enough investment in the distribution system. The regulators have not appreciated the need to induct technology and set hard targets on the distribution companies.
Right.
After all, they're their licensees.
Right, Mr. Razdan, I would like to get Mr. I.A. Khan, who's the Energy Advisor to the Planning Commission, at this point. Since we're talking about regulators, Mr. Khan, there is a strong regulatory structure in place in the power sector. The regulators are independent entities, yet we have seen regulators, if industry voices are to be heard or believed, not take decisive steps as and when they are required. What's the reason behind this? As far as regulators are concerned, Mr. Khan, there is no political interference.
Yeah. I agree with Mr. Razdan because they are, as per the Act, they are independent entities and they are supposed to take decisions on the ARR filed by the utilities every year. But sometimes, the state governments are, having the policies to, supply power at a subsidized rates. And it is a fact also that there are certain consumers, their paying capacity is less, so they have to be subsidized. But the Act clearly says that the state governments are, you can say, they can take independent decisions to provide subsidized power supply to certain segment of consumers who cannot pay. So, but the Act also mandates that towards that payment, towards that electricity supply, the state government has to pay upfront to the electricity distribution companies. So regulators, they are not doing, sometimes some states regulators, they have delayed the you can say tariff awards by 4 years, 5 years. Definitely, the forum of regulators has taken up the issue, and in the near future, they may be, doing the thing. This scheme, which is the, now approved by the government, also puts the condition that the tariff revision has to be every year.
Right.
They need not wait for the state government's directions or instructions.
Right. We'll move on to that as well, and I'd like to talk about the pros and cons of the CCA decision. But I think Soma Banerjee has a point to make here.
I mean, I'd like to address this to both Mr. Razdan, whom I have learnt a lot from, as well as Mr. Khan. Both of you all use the word supposed to be independent, and that's, I think, the bottom line. Regulators have not remained independent in this country. You rightly said, Mr. Khan, that many of them have not filed tariff orders, and CERC a few months back actually took a suo motu decision that tariff orders have to be passed whether the states come to them or not with tariff revisions. The fact is that even today, these guys can pass tariff orders which will be so minimal that they'll not cover the cost or the actual cost that is supposed to be. Electricity Act provides for payment of subsidies, and rightly so, but that is only if the state budgets can give them that money.
Right.
Without the regulators really performing their duty as regulators, I don't see this happening. Second, and most important, the very culture of regulators in this country, most of the regulators are coming from the bureaucracy today. I think that has also got to do a lot with the fact that political patronage takes over regulators and they don't remain as independent as they should.
I'd like to put that to Mr. Razdan. Do you agree with what Soma just said? Are regulators increasingly being affected by political decisions and political pressure?
I think, first of all, Soma said they are supposed to be independent. I think each one of us is supposed to be independent. So are journalists, so are bureaucrats to some extent. But I think the regulators have got the protection of the highest judiciary. And it's a very clear signal that they are supposed to be independent, whether it's a matter of fact, whether they exercise that independence or not. And I think the time has come when they are not only should be exercising their independence, but also demonstrating the ability to govern the sector. Because the scheme of things is that the governance has passed from the government to the regulators. The government doesn't file these tariff petitions. They should be coming in as interveners or something, or as policy, the regulators can certainly call the government that if a subsidy is to be paid, please make sure that it is done on time. And if nothing is stopping the regulators from moving suo moto and wanting to monitor what is going on.
Right.
I think what I see as a very positive step is, you see, we in this new arrangement, which I think is a very fair deal and a fair option to the states to mend the sector, because we must understand power is a concurrent subject. Why do we keep blaming the central government every time? I think that now the blame will lie squarely on the state governments if they are not able to put their public sector companies in order.
Right.
They must ensure that the results are there forthwith. The regulators must ensure that the power is indented well in time, and the power supply to consumers conform to certain standards of reliability.
Right, Mr. Razdan.
I think it's a very testing time for the whole regulatory mechanism.
Mr. Razdan, we'll take a small break here, but when we come back, I'd like to speak to my guests about tariffs, as well as ATC losses as well, and the power sector and the crisis as a whole as well. Don't go anywhere, lots more to come on The Big Picture. Keep watching Rajya Sabha Television. Welcome back to The Big Picture. Mr. I.A. Khan is still with us. Mr. Khan, the Ahluwalia Committee of 2002-2003 had warned of what he had termed a moral hazard of such a restructuring scheme. That is, the tendency of the state governments and state-owned utilities to slip back into old habits in the hope of a future bailout. Is there a danger, Mr. Khan, that state utilities and electricity boards, that they will take it easy now after this breather? And is there a way of ensuring that this concern is sufficiently addressed, perhaps through contractual quid pro quos from the state government and utilities?
Actually, you have to make a just distinction between that package and this scheme. That package or that scheme was practically for the outstanding dues of the central utilities like NTPC, NHPC and Power Grid, which the state electricity utilities were not able to pay, and there that debt or the outstandings were restructured over a period of time so that they can pay easily. That was the facilitation to make the payment easy for the utilities to the central PSUs. This time, this scheme is for the restructuring and giving some relief, some comfort to not only the power utilities but also to the lending institutions who have reached certain level of lending, and beyond that they were not able to lend to the DISCOMs, which have become so problematic.
Right.
So this is scheme.
Right.
Yeah.
I'd like to go to Mr. Razdan now and ask him this. Since we talked about, Mr. Razdan, earlier as well, ATC losses as well. Since 2001, debt recast of state power utilities, most states have seen the separation of generation and distribution of power. But the ground reality is, and lots of media reports and government reports corroborate this, that the rupee value of aggregate technical and commercial ATC losses in power distribution has risen relentlessly, although some states, most notably Gujarat and Delhi, have shown some improvement. Why have the ATC losses risen so much? Is it just lower tariffs and power theft, or are there more structural causes to it?
I think, when you talk of rupee value, then I would ask you to do a certain discounting also and see what the NPV formula works out to. I wouldn't get into that debate, but I think the present percentage, a national percentage, varies between 26 to 28% on average by two reports that I've seen. I think it's totally unacceptable. We should not accept anything above 15%, which was something we set out for the restructured APDRP program. That, of course, was confined to the cities and towns of a certain population. But I think there is a lot of technical improvement that is required, and that the bureaucracy doesn't come into that picture at all. I think it has been a failure of governance, a failure of good technical management of the power sector. And if there is a collusion in some cases or independent malpractice by the staff of the distribution companies or consumers, I think technology is there to provide answers for metering, which I think should be 100% compulsory. I'm surprised that the regulatory commissions have not insisted on 100% metering for all consumers. This is the first step that ought to be implemented. And you're right, you see, in a way, this scheme also does talk marginally of those issues, but Mr. Khan was absolutely right that the decade-back scheme was really to bail out the dues of the public sector generation companies and the central transmission utility. And this scheme is essentially for the distress that has been caused to the financial institutions.
Right.
And I think within the limited frame that they're operating, I think this scheme is a good chance. It provides, I think, a lot of meat to the media and to the public to be vigilant, because ultimately if tariffs keep going up, it's the public that is going to be affected.
Absolutely.
There is one aspect, of course, of increasing tariffs, and that is lack of adequate fuel supply. Now that will have to be addressed in tandem by the government. Otherwise, if the imported component of fuel keeps increasing, or if we are thinking of making money out of auctioning coal blocks and maximizing revenue out of that, that hit will have to be taken by a power tariff which is determined on L1, so that L1 or the lowest one also rises.
Right, Mr. Razdan, since you mentioned tariffs, I'd like to ask Soma this question. Since he mentioned power tariffs, increasing tariffs surely are not the answer. Are they? Distributors and SCBs must make sure that the increase in tariff is at competitive rates, and they must also keep the consumer interest in mind.
Yeah, so for that you need competition to come in. The fact that, the Electricity Act actually allows all of this, but unfortunately we've not gone ahead. So for one thing is the open access system. The open access system allowed people to actually have a choice of generators from whom they could buy power. The moment you have competition and you have multiple choices, they will compete against each other to give you the best services at the best rates. But that has not happened because states do not want this to happen or have not really worked on that. But I have a question for both our panelists who have great knowledge of how this has worked. Sirs, if I could just put it across, Athar, is that, what has really changed between 2002 and now? It was the central PSUs, as you rightly said, who are being bailed out then. It's the lenders who are being bailed out today. 5 years or 10 years later, it could be some other body. The culprit at all stages is the same. It is the state governments who do not allow the political patronage, which does not allow. It's basically the change of the political will.
Right.
Do you think any of this can be guaranteed that we'll not have a situation like this again?
Mr. Khan, could you respond to that?
Yeah, so this scheme has made it clear that the state discoms are their own babies. They have to manage perfectly henceforth, because central government cannot bail out the every time.
You said that last time.
And discoms are basically run by the state governments, and they have to take care of the loss levels or the efficient management in future. So that is why the scheme suggests whatever outstanding liabilities are there, 50% have to be taken over by state governments, and remaining 50% also restructuring will be there. But during the transition period, again the state governments are made responsible by this scheme to manage the cash flow requirement for the discoms to operate during the transition period. So this scheme makes it very clear that the state governments will be responsible from now onwards for everything, whatever is happening.
Right, Mr. Razdan, very briefly, if you want to comment on that, very briefly, we have to go into another break.
Well, I think you see between 2002 and today, the difference is that time there were hardly 2 or 3 regulators in place in the country, in the states. Today, all the regulators are in place. So I think the situation is that it is a regulated sector which has failed to be regulated.
Right.
And I think we've got to place the focus there and the onus is entire, first of all, on the regulators, secondly, on the distribution companies to get their act together. And as Soma says, I wish there was competition, but there are not enough players available. And then there are ideological problems that we're very scared of introducing the private sector.
Right, point taken, sir. We'll take another short break right now, but when we come back on the big picture, we'll discuss the future of the power sector and the need for tangible reforms. With my guests, Soma Banerjee, Anil Razdan and I, Khan. Don't go anywhere. Keep watching the big picture. Welcome back. You're still watching the big picture. Anil Razdan is still with us. Sir, experts and analysts also feel that 49% FDI in power exchanges is a welcome step, but it is also a drop in the ocean given the issues that these exchanges face. What they've asked for is an easier regulatory environment, improved transmission capacity to keep pace with generation capacity, infrastructure to transmission to high areas with high demand, and remove power generation roadblocks like coal shortage. Now, these are just proposed ideas that have been mooted not by the government, not at the government level, but by power exchanges, by distributors, by power companies. Are these feasible at all, and what other reform steps are needed to combat the larger power crisis in the country?
Well, I think first and foremost, the forecasting for power demand should be accurate, and the regulators ought to go minutely into that. The power procurement process needs to become more transparent and more efficient, in the sense that some states have been calling for bids and sitting on those bids for a very considerable length of time, which discourages the generators from putting in bids to particularly those states which are not quick in decision making. I think that time lag has to be reduced substantially to about a month or so, and I think much more transparency and a public watch over it. I'd be very happy if the media keeps a close watch on how power is being procured and whether all the accounts are in order. And I think we have to simultaneously tackle this issue of open access, not really coming into its own account of misuse of some of the provisions of shortage of power, etc. I think the law will need an amendment there, if at all in the first instance.
Right.
We need to remove those blocks, but I don't expect that to happen immediately given the state of the legislative process in the country and the fractured politics at the moment.
Right. Since
so
you mentioned,
we may have to make do with the best solutions that have been offered.
Right, sir. I'll go quickly across to Mr. Khan, and very briefly, sir, if you could. People are labeling this move as just yet another bailout. These people say that structural reform, like big moves perhaps on the privatization front, as well as maybe perhaps a franchise agreement would be the right direction to take. But, sir, with the politics of power reigning supreme, do you see these measures at all as possible?
Yeah, already, many states have appointed franchises in different cities. You can take the example of, Kanpur or Agra, and in Maharashtra also. So already franchises are being appointed to, bring down the loss levels and improve the efficiency. And the 12th plan also has suggested to take up more number of areas, urban areas particularly, where commercial viability will be the attractive factor for the private investor. So definitely the government has taken up the measures to involve the private investment in this distribution sector, and it is working well. Wherever the franchises have been appointed, they have improved the revenues of the area which has been franchised. So definitely the government will try to involve more and more private investors depending on the model which is selected by the states. We are not insisting a uniform model across the states. The choice is given to the states to adopt the franchisee model which suits them, to improve their revenue requirements.
Right, point taken, sir. Soma, we're nearing the end of our show. If you had a 3-point prescription for the government to take us out of this power crisis, what would that be?
Okay, so I have a 2-point at the moment, and the third point can be independent of the 2-point.
Later.
on the first point, I think at the central level, you need more integration. So you need actually energy-related ministries to work together, maybe as an integrated energy ministry, because the fuel problem and the power problem do not go hand to hand. They're on different pages. So you need an integrated approach at the central level. At the state level, you need more division of powers. You need people to get out of the political patronage. You need independence for distributors, generators, procurers, etc. But finally, I think I will again re-emphasize, all this can only work if you have independent regulators. Regulators who came in to actually do the bad job which politicians can't do and to take those hard decisions. The Act has enabled them. We want the regulators to actually move and see that these reforms take place.
On that point, Soma, we'll end our show. And like Soma has said, of course, the independence of the regulatory bodies is of paramount importance. At the central level, perhaps more integration between ministries is something that should be aimed at. That's all the time we have on The Big Picture tonight. Athar Khan saying goodbye, good night, and thanks for watching.